podium there, unless there's an issue with it, in which case, find whatever works for you.
I'm going to stand on the side.
We've also had someone ask if they can record the round. If you do not wish for your speech to be recorded, please say so before your speech starts. And we'll just stop the recording. Beyond that, we'll record it as normal. Whenever you're ready, PM.
What does it mean to write from the perspective of the victim? It means writing short stories, probably, or maybe movies, like scripts, going through the day-to-day lives of individuals, looking through conflicts through the experiences of individuals, and inserting the broader context into that experience. So maybe talking about the lives of Palestinians in Gaza, what they have to go through as individual people, and inserting the broader international conflict through there. It is movies like When They See Us that take us through the exact things that the exact things that the New York Pride, for example, what happened to them. Secondly, what is it like to write through the lens of an observer? You're going to see struggles, yes, but you focus on things like large-scale community suffering, but because the observer, at the very minimum, cannot enter into the minds of people, they have to focus on things like statistics, they have to focus on things like the broader experiences. You may give like equal weight, for example, to both sides of the conflict to some extent, because you're expected to be more objective. I want to note, both sides can be accurate, both sides can be factual, and both things that you can write can be true. The second thing I want to note is that opposition will say later that you are just viewed as more objective and therefore you will sell more. One, it's unclear why you have the capacity to be objective if these are your lived experiences. You're oftentimes defined through them. You see life through this lens. But secondly, even if you can be objective as an individual, oftentimes you are not perceived as objective. You are part of the minority community. You are in the conflict yourself, and that's why observers or readers will still view you as inserting your own experiences through that, no matter how hard you try. You cannot detach yourself from those experiences, and that is why they're going to fail. Lastly, what are the interests of the minority writer? It is to relay your feelings through your art, because the fact that you're writing about it, the fact that you chose this path in the first place and not any other career path, or not to write about any other thing than your experience, suggests you have deep longing for your community, and the fact that you want to tell people about what's happening. It suggests that you view this community as incredibly important, as incredibly underrepresented. The reason why this is the most important impact or like interest in the round is because it's the most certain. Things like sales, things like exposure are often affected by other externalities, like for example the resources you have to market your work, or the fact that the 24-hour news cycle may talk about your work for some time, but they might forget about it tomorrow. The fact that people might not be conducive to learning about these things in the first place because of the way that discussions in the broader society are going. So your fulfillment as a writer is the most certain. The secondary interest is about money. Obviously you want your book to sell. We think again this is secondary. Will prove later why that's a wash. Lastly, this debate is not about changing the minds of white people or people who are already overtly racist. Those people will not change on both sides of the house. It's about representing your community, making sure that they have a voice. First argument before the POI. Why is it more fulfilling to write about your experiences in this way? Firstly, because most of white culture or dominant culture focuses on an observer's view of your culture. It's often peddled by things like news outlets or one-sided perceptions of what you're really experiencing. 3 reasons. 1, because they do not have access to your experiences. Oftentimes, the inequalities inherent within society are dominated by majoritarian groups. Even if they have some sympathy or empathy for you, they cannot understand what you're going through. And oftentimes, what they're able to do is take a broader perspective and export it to the world, but they don't go into the lives of these people, and they don't understand what these lives are, which means 2 things. 1, you feel extremely underrepresented. Maybe there are statistics about how black people face racism in America, statistics about how many Palestinians are dying in Gaza, but you know that they will never fully understand what you really feel and what you truly experience. But secondly, it means that you experience experience microaggressions about things that they don't feel is important. The struggles of day-to-day racism that cannot be combated by things like law, cannot be combated by things like courts, that cannot be solved by other things that might be solved by broader society. Opposition says we can discuss these things as well. Maybe you can discuss the things that your entire community faces, and that's why it gets attention. But oftentimes, the microaggressions that you yourself feel, that your people in your family, that your friends experience, cannot be perceived or cannot be discussed properly by other people, and that is why you feel extremely underrepresented. Secondly, the second reason why it's more fulfilling is because the way that you can use stylistic devices and interpret your own experiences and feel your feelings through the writing of your art, not just the selling of it, not just people reading it, but the experience of writing and creating it in and of itself is much broader, because you don't have to peddle to things like objectivity, because you don't have to pretend that you're something that you're not. What does this mean? One, that you just feel extremely fulfilled in the creation of this art. It doesn't matter if this will sell, it doesn't matter if other people get it, because you yourself are able to work through those experiences, work through those traumas. But secondly, if it does sell, that means people are able to experience these things, are able to understand you, and that is a great benefit in this debate. Closing go.
So it seems a bit weird that you're a journalist who reports on facts and figures on our side and a fictional writer on your side. Wouldn't we also have fiction just the main character is one of the majority there?
No. Like, you can be a fiction writer. We can also be journalists writing feature stories, right? The difference is that you are writing from the white perspective. You are not white. You are not part of that experience. You have to pretend that you're something that you're not. You have to push your feelings down, because the things that you're writing about are not the things that you're experiencing. You are writing just like everyone else, and you're not using your own experiences to live through that work. Secondly, why will you still be successful on our side? One, because there is liberalized access to information, which means that people are just far more progressive and open to new ideas now because of things like the technology boom and the access to the internet. Secondly, because the world is significantly more progressive than it was 50 years ago. Even if there is a right-wing shift, we think that that's still to an extent, the world is still more progressive. At the very minimum, that means publishers will buy this. And I want to note that there's far more competition on their side. That means that they have to compete with white writers. They have to compete with other observers that might be seen as more objective, that might actually be more objective because they have a greater capacity to be so. But secondly, why will the community support you then, even if broader society won't? One, because they themselves feel like victims of the system. This emboldens that feeling of injustice. That is why they will buy your book. Your experiences cannot be summarized into a statistic, and that is what a lot of minorities already feel. Even minorities in other communities that might do things like stand up for you as well. There's very little forms of outward catharsis available to these people. That's why they will opt in. This is important because it proves at the very minimum you will have an audience. You're not likely to fail. On their side, they have to prove why you have the capacity to be objective, and where you will be perceived as objective, they are likely to fail. Thanks.
We'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I would leave the opposition to begin the opposition case. Hear, hear.
As a writer, the main source of fulfillment is the idea that you're enacting some kind of change, that you're making some kind of meaningful impact through your work. We think the best way to make impact is by writing from the perspective of the observer. For that reason, we're very happy to oppose. I'm going to respond to just one idea that we hear from the opening government before we move on to our team's constructives, because I think most responses are justified. Because I think the idea that there is competition from the white people that are writing about your community, and therefore you are going to be crowded out, is simply untrue. Because we accept the premise that people view you as someone that is directly involved. People view you as someone that is in that minority group. There's a particular value to reading your work as a minority writer, even if you are trying to write from the perspective of an observer, that is still something that we have as an edge, and all the benefits of the community still supporting you still apply, even if you are writing from the perspective of the observer. The first thing I will then argue is that this is far more effective in reaching out and messaging to the community. Because importantly, not all people inside the minority community are self-aware that they are minorities or that they are being oppressed. Most often people lack that understanding. It is important that we are able to reach out to the community and help them gain that understanding that they must be fighting for themselves, that they must advocate for themselves. The first thing that I'll argue here is that an observer's perspective is far better at for fostering an understanding of what the community is going through. Because the issue is that often communities are not compelled to believe that their situations are particularly horrible. Often the reason for that is that struggle is oftentimes normalized and internalized. People that are women think that their day-to-day experiences as women very often are very normal experiences that they go through and are not particularly egregious forms of misogyny because they've been growing up in their entire lives in a society that is particularly patriarchic. Very often, minority communities are not all activists for that very reason, because oftentimes people do not necessarily always empathize with the idea that they are under struggle at that moment in time. Think about cases of like abuse victims, where very commonly abuse victims do not understand that they are being abused. They don't perceive their situations as particularly horrible. They see these things as normal until someone from an outside perspective points out that your situation is particularly irregular and abnormal, and that you should be aware that this is not normal things to be going through. Importantly, going through an observer's perspective allows for that understanding. You allow for people to take a step back from what they're immediately going through and see from an outsider's lens just how weird your situation is, just how abnormal and horrible your situation is. And that is important for the community themselves to understand, that they are not going through something that is normal. From an outsider's perspective, this is absolutely horrible, and we want to understand that. That is, I think, important, because maybe there are some people on that side that can empathize because some parts of the community are understanding that they are victims. I would argue that those benefits are marginal to the extent that those people are likely to be understanding on either side of the house. The more important actor, because obviously these communities are not homogenous, the more important target audience are those that are not as aware, those that are therefore able to make a meaningful change in the demographics. That is the change that we're able to bring on our side of the house. The second thing I'll argue here before I get to POI is that an observer's perspective provides a very meaningful, different point of view. Because importantly, as a minority individual, even if you are able to empathize with the things that are being written about, if they are the same things that you've already been going through all the time, it is particularly unclear what the difference is that you gain from reading about the things that you are going through in a way that is written from the perspective of a victim, especially if you already feel that you are a victim at that point in time. The meaningful difference on our side is that you're able to see this from an outsider lens in a way that tells you that this is something that is different from, in a way that comes off as different from your overall experience, in a way that therefore seems like something that is valuable to read and valuable to see, and therefore is able to be something that the minority community themselves have an interest in actively reading. That is why we have a far better understanding that is portrayed to the minority community themselves. That is incredibly important. Before I move on to closing.
So why do you think a lot of these struggles are internalized and normalized by individuals themselves?
Because they are the ones that are living through that experience, and that is their normal experience. When you see this from an outside perspective, that's when you understand that this is not normal for the vast majority of people. The second thing I'm going to then argue is that the observer's perspective is far more compelling to the majority of readers, the majority community, the white people that they want to target as well. The issue here is that the majority oftentimes just is not familiar with what is happening in the first instance when it comes to minority communities. Maybe that could just be to a lack of knowledge itself, where you don't always know about what exactly the minority communities, especially the indigenous communities, are going through. You can only speculate because you're not in those shoes, and oftentimes you just aren't particularly reading everything about them. Or it could also just be because you are just not in those shoes in the first instance, and things that might seem normal to you, seem okay to you, are not okay to them. Importantly though, in those cases, the victim's perspective has a few issues. One, there's just an increased hurdle to empathizing with that perspective. Because on that side of the house, you need to first learn about the presence of that struggle in the first instance. You need to understand that those things are real things that happen. And then in addition to that, you need to then try to put yourself in the shoes of the victim that is going through those struggles that you're just learning about. That is incredibly difficult when you're trying to imagine a struggle in the very first place, and then trying to imagine yourself being under that struggle that you're trying to imagine. All these things mean that it's very difficult to empathize in that perspective. But in addition to that, it just feels a lot more fictional because you're trying to put yourself in the imagination of an imagination. That is quite difficult. The difference on our side is that you do not need to go through the various hurdles. You just need to be able to learn from the outsider's perspective in that book. That is what the observer is seeing. You can more easily put yourself in the shoes of that observer, because in reality you will be an observer as well. That's far more palatable, that's far easier for you to empathize, and the impact very simply is that you understand that those struggles are real and you gain a reason to fight for that. Secondly, often the victim's perspective is just far too depressing in a way that the average person that is detached from the struggles have no reason to want to read. Unless you are already someone that is inclined to support minority groups, you have no reason to want to read about the struggles of the minority and put yourself in the shoes of the victim. The difference is that when you see yourself as just being an observer of watching a horror story happen, there's far more reason to read that because you're putting yourself in a far less depressing point of view, and that's something that people are just far more likely to feel palatable to. But finally, I think when you put yourself in the shoes of the victim, that just makes you feel hopeless. You don't see yourself being able to do anything about it when that is the shoes that you're putting yourself as the majority group. Because even as the person that is in the majority, when you're just in the shoes of the victim, there is nothing about that you can do. When you're seeing it from the outsider's perspective, you're far more able to evaluate what are the things that I can do as an observer in that situation to try to make things better, to try to fight for that community as well, and to support them. That is a far more valuable perspective that we're able to give out to the majority as well. The final thing I'll very briefly discuss is the idea of catharsis and fulfillment as a writer, because that's, I think, the push that we get from opening government as well. I think, importantly, just writing about your own experiences, again, is not necessarily the most fulfilling experience as a writer. And this is because, one, most people can really live their lives through diaries. If you are trying to write something that's meaningfully to be sent out to other people as well, you want to write something that is a particularly new perspective, a new angle, and being able to do that is far better as well. But in particular, I think being able to try to write from a perspective of an observer, especially because you yourself are not an observer, it's better for you as well being able to understand your own situation, to try to rethink your life, try to understand that from a different perspective, from a different angle that is particularly new to you, that is incredibly fulfilling as a writer, that is important. For all those reasons, opening off.
We'd like to then leave the opposition with that fine speech, now with the DPM to continue the government case. You're here.
The problem in status quo is not that people cannot see. We have statistics of racism for Asians in the United States. We know of the genocide that is happening in Palestine by people in Israel. This is not a question about whether or not people know your struggle, but whether or not they understand your struggle. What do they have to defend? As an observer, you cannot enter the minds of these individuals. You cannot illustrate their reactions because you have to keep a tone that is overall neutral, even if it is incredibly difficult. You suppress your feelings because you feel as if you cannot allow any sort of bias to enter, especially if they don't want to portray you as the victim, even if you have sorely felt this all throughout your life. As an observer, you are relegated to broad intuitions about why things could be bad, even if to the average white person, for example, even if to the internalized person under their comparative, they don't understand how microaggressions can be painful. When you tell a story from the eyes of a people that have been ignored, rejected, you talk about their feelings, their complex lived experiences, and for the first time in their lives, you finally humanize them. The first question I want to answer is whether or not these individuals actually do subscribe and understand what you are going to be writing about. Because there was this weird claim coming from opening opposition to say, well, they don't understand that they're suffering. One, this is obviously empirically untrue. If you are hurt, if other people discriminate against you, if you are excluded in classrooms, if people deprioritize you in every other line of work and your line of living, then obviously you will feel these things because humans are socially conditioned to want to feel accepted in the vast majority of instances. There are oftentimes very, very real instances of harm. Even in the worst case of internalization, there's a greater breadth and understanding that these things are relatively more important, such as in the case for example, social media telling individuals and women, encouraging them to, for example, engage in the Me Too movement and call out actions that could potentially be bad. Secondly, I want to talk about catharsis, because even if you don't believe whether or not this can make money or not, this is likely the most important benefit in the debate. You talk to your friends and family. You surround yourself with individuals from this minority group. You are likely to implicate their experiences, talk about them through the lens of what you are going to write, which at the very least means that you are subscribing and finally transcribing their own lived experiences into something that is real and tangible. What I explain is that even if you believe that objectiveness is a relatively important value, they don't explain why this has to come specifically from a minority writer, when what you do have is this perspective, the status of being from that minority group, which means that you're able to represent them in a uniquely good way. Secondly, I point out that you cannot do this well. In the vast majority of instances, it is incredibly difficult for the vast individual to do this in the first place. I want you to understand this minority writer. You are angry. In the vast majority of instances, what brought you to writing in the first place is a dissatisfaction with your situation. The fact that you want to write about the struggle of your minority community means that that struggle exists in the first place and that there is something to write about such that you feel a strong knocking to want to do so. What you do under their side, when you force yourself under observer's point of view, when you have to suppress all the feelings of discontent and hatred that you have, is you have to make sure that these things cannot show themselves in your writing. But lastly, it's about branding, right? If you are writing from an observer's point of view, that presumes that you are not writing from the perspective of the community. That means that you are selling your work with a clear need of this being an observer's point of view, that you are not relying on the individual lived experiences of the community. And that's terrible, because no matter what, your bias is always going to show to some extent. It will manifest in your writing. It will manifest in all of these things, and therefore, there's a clear disconnect with the sorts of people that they want to convince and the sorts of people that we cater to under government.
Right.
What do we then give you in terms of benefit? The first thing that we explain is that these are very, very real lived experiences of individuals. There are likely very, very few minority writers that come from your community. Most of them, for example, engage in blue-collar work, have technical degrees, and therefore don't have time to understand their own lived struggles, but nevertheless feel the pain. What you're giving is an outlet for them to understand these things. You're humanizing their lived experiences in the vast majority of instances when you finally justify that the individuals who did this to you, the white person who, for example, stole your land, or the individual ways in which the law has fucked you over, are things that are tangibly real, and the feelings that are being unpacked here are relatively good. But secondly, I point out that in most instances, this is just considerably better for you as well. Because even in the worst case where this could be controversial, this controversy is good. And the reason for that is because it's unclear to what extent then you as a minority writer can get your book out or can get whatever you write out into the public. But what is clear if it is controversial is that when it is talked about in news media, when it is talked about in forums, when people understand and finally see the story, it creates discussions around issues, and it creates discussions around the lived experiences of these individuals. How should you situate this, and why is this prerequisite to anything in the round? Because money, for example, could be a good or could be a bad. Perhaps you don't understand how these things manifest. But being able to finally bring the stories of your mother who you love very much into the limelight, finally being able to write about things that are important to you, being able to synthesize these things in ways that everybody sees because you became a writer in the first place and you want these things to be seen is the most important thing. Before I go on, closing.
So obviously we're not just writing about white people and their daily lives. Your mother might be a character, for example, that this person made friends with or decided to close relationships with. Why wouldn't these experiences shine through that?
The first thing that I want to note is that the dissonance that most individuals feel is that they don't have empathy for these individuals. They're just statistics. They're people who they don't understand. These are people without feelings within the stories that you create. We humanize them because in most instances, what observers cannot do is enter the minds of these individuals. The easiest way to build empathy and connection is by showing that these people feel pain, that it hurts when individuals turn away from you, that it hurts when people dissociate, that it hurts when all of these things happen in a unique way when you write from the perspective of a direct victim. Lastly, let's talk about money here, and this is engaging in their very best case. Because I point out that backlash gets significantly worse under opening opposition if you try and write under the guise of objectivity and an observer's point of view, but obviously fail to do that to the same extent. When you get more catharsis under our comparative, it is obviously better. But why are we more likely to make more money and be sensationalized? One, oftentimes an observer's point of view is just incredibly boring. If you cannot talk about the interests, the complex actions, the lived experiences of these individuals, there's very little to draw on that hasn't been talked about already. What you can offer as a niche, as a minority writer in specific, where lots of individuals perhaps from the majority have already talked about you, is a different perspective that is unique to you. Secondly, in the vast majority of instances, these industries suffer from oversaturation. You peddle on your own niche and these things sell, especially in adjacent minority communities where these things can be persuasive, where there's a large degree of catharsis to be had. But thirdly, if it is true that this creates a stir, in the vast majority of instances, you have minority blocks that have been increasing in my purchasing power that can at the very least read these stories and feel represented under the guise of what we think is relatively important. What do you get at the end of this debate then? You have more financial stability under our comparative, a greater capacity to make money because you can peddle on your own niche, which means that you can fund and help your community in more direct and tangible ways, which means that you can fund your writing career into the future, which could be the most important thing, and you can finally give yourself the avenue to talk about experiences that are more likely to be suppressed and overtaken by majority voices. For these reasons, very, very proud to propose.
Would I thank the DVM, that's fine. Speech now with the DLO, close off the top half. You're here.
Starting in 3. The first thing I'm going to rebut is to reframe the characterization of this debate. Because OG has this absurd framing in this debate that like observers mean that you have to write in statistics. I think this is wrong. I don't think any other team is going to agree with this. Closing argument better defend the words than should. Because the fact that you are in the perspective of an observer doesn't mean that you have to write in the form of statistics. It means that you are going to be a position that is not the victim in the story, but still can interact with the victim in certain ways. For example, like number the stars, as we read it in like elementary school. We see this from a perspective of those who are not the direct victims in the story, but there still can be interactions. For example, you can write in the perspective of a journalist in Gaza who sees the struggles that these people are going through. You can see this in the perspective of a man in a workplace who sees the misogyny of the woman that is placed in the workplace. We think that these things are possible when you're actually writing the story. We really don't get why OG doesn't engage with this framing. But then, the second thing I want to just note out is, I think that this can also happen on a micro level, because you don't have to talk about a community as a whole. I think it is more persuasive that, especially when it comes to fiction, like the person talks about what events happen in a micro level when they are addressing this. But then the third thing I want to just frame is that I think the fact that you chose to be a writer itself means that you actually want to make the struggles known to the other people in the community. And in order to do this, money is a prerequisite to a certain extent, because you need money in order to keep writing. We're going to prove to you why this actually leads to more buy-in under our side of the bench. Then, the second thing I want to talk about is, I want to talk about the idea of catharsis, because like, they say the important benefit that they hedge is that like catharsis is the most important thing. The first thing I want to do is I want to like kind of decrease the degree of this claim, because I think when you actually want to feel catharsis, there are many other ways that you can opt into this. This doesn't have to be unique to a writer. For example, you can talk with your friends, you can talk with your family, you can talk with other people who are going through the struggle, and catharsis has alternatives. But then the second thing is, I think that the process in which you write as an observer can also be similarly cathartic to a certain extent, because if you want to actually write as an observer, the process in which you need to go through is you need to see how other people observe you as a minority. You have to talk with other people who are outside your community. You have to like talk about what is going to happen, like how these people perceive you. I think that this process itself, and learning how other people actually perceive you as well, this process itself can actually inherently be cathartic. We think that the margin of catharsis that they get under their side is marginal at best. But then the third thing is, I don't think catharsis is the most important thing in this round. If this person wanted to like only experience catharsis, they could write in their diary. I think that the most important thing is how this creates more buy-in and change for the community. Then the third thing I want to talk about is, I want to talk about why there's no buy-in under their side of the bench. And this is important because they never engage into why this is likely to create more buy-in. The mechanism that they give you is, oh, the world is like right-wing, but they still read, right? I'm going to give you 3 reasons why our side actually creates more buy-in. The first thing is, if you put yourself in the shoes of the victim and you visually illustrate the experiences that the victim goes through, this often triggers guilt and avoidance from the majority community, because usually they are the ones who are perpetrating that form of oppression. This means that, like, for example, if you are a dude in the United States who supports Trump, but then you read the stories of victims in Gaza, you don't want to read it in the first place because you feel like that event happens because of your some contribution that comes from you. We think that this leads to the sense of avoidance and guilt that actually avoids you from reading that story as a whole. This means that white people are not likely to read that story from the first place. But then the second thing is, I think that when it comes to the victim's narrative, people are likely to perceive this in a very defensive manner, which is likely to actually create more backlash under their side. And this rebuts the framing that comes from their side, because they say for some reason there's going to be backlash because the observer is not actually objective. We think that this is not true to begin with. This is the reason for this is that oftentimes when actually victims perpetrate the narrative that they're actually being oppressed, they use very strong narratives in the story of how like this man like hates me, or like this oppressor hates me, and this creates very visceral senses of victimhood in these kind of stories. We think that this leads to actually more defensive interactions with the people who actually need to read these stories. So for example, when this story of like how this woman who was born in like 1982 faced a lot of misogyny in Korea, this led to huge amounts of backlash because it was in the perspective of the victim. People thought it was unrealistic for this woman to actually face these kind of backlashes. The comparative on our side of the bench is that if you actually explain this through the perspective of an observer, that observer is seemingly more objective. This person actually has the process of interacting with that victim within the story, which means that it actually has a lower barrier of entry in the first place, but also due to the fact that this person actually has the process of explaining what this person went through within the story, this person can actually interact with the victim or understand the struggles better. Closing.
So if you write in the perspective of a Korean feminist, you will still incur the same degree of backlash. So backlash on your end is still symmetrical because either it's for the victim or the observer, it's still not going to be the same.
No, I think I explained what happens within the story rather than like the author itself. Because like even if we buy their case and say like, so like even if that degree of backlash is symmetric, we think that what happens within the story and how these people interact within the story is going to be different. But then the third thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about the feelings when it comes to the perspective of observers. Because I think that when it comes to like observers, the important thing here is that most of the people reading are going to be in the perspective of the observer, which they never engage to. Because like when it comes to the community, we think that like when it comes to like the members of the community, I think the like the people who are reading outside of the community is going to be in the process of the observer, which is important because it influences how that person perceives the struggle. How the observer perceives the struggle in the process is going to gain more empathy from the people who actually read this outside of the community. And this because now the writer would have to fill in the processes in which how this observer interacts with the victim in the process. This is going to actually gain in more buy-in under their side. But then the second thing is we already told you why this actually leads to more communication from the writer's perspective to talk about other people as well. The process itself in which the writer actually tries to write the story creates more likelihood that this story is going to be palatable. If you just write the victim's perspective, you don't have to do this communication, you don't have to go through this. If you're writing in the perspective of the observer, this is important. The third thing I want to just flag is I think the important thing here is the margin of this debate lies on the people who do not know that they are oppressed, even though they are in this kind of minority race or like minority ethnicity. Because if people are viscerally like sure that they are being oppressed and they are going through this victimhood in the first place, there's not a necessity for these people to actually read these kind of books in the first place. We think the most important actors are those who are unaware to some extent that they are being oppressed. We think that this leads to a mechanism of how these people can be more aware of their struggles to begin with. This actually leads to more buy-in when it comes to social movements, etc. But then the last thing I want to flag out is I think this creates more buy-in, personal interest from the perspective of the writer itself, because buy-in leads to more money. The money means you can actually perceive more long-term writing in the future, those that you want to do in the future as well.
I'd like to thank the deal of that fine speech, and as on top half of the great debate so far, we'll now let members of government to open up the back half. Hear, hear.
Opening opposition tells individuals that the only valid way to view your life is to whitewash yourself and to see it through another writer's perspective. It's a horrible narrative to tell an actor and a horrible thing that any individual should internalize. CG will end this debate very simply. We'll tell you the nuance difference of this struggle, and why even if we buy opposition's best characterization, that this probably can be somebody of similar community members, either the father of somebody who got assaulted, or the daughter of somebody who got assaulted again. Why necessarily this is probably someone that is, why it's probably the direct portrayal of victim-based experiences are a unique metric that only individuals can access, and why even if it's an observer that from the same community or the stories will never be the same, and the kinds of experiences that you're telling are never going to be alike. What are the kinds of things that observers are likely to tell? Because we don't really agree that it's broad levels, like every house has called this out, but I don't think it's statistics or journalism. It probably relies on common known lived experiences, because you want to be palatable towards a somewhat section of the majority, so you have to rely on lived experiences. And not only just lived experiences, but lived experiences that individuals probably already know about. So these are things that are already like out there in the broad like mindset of the internet, where individuals know that African American individuals have been discriminated by police brutality. So you rely on a lot of common narratives that already exist, and they already get a lot of airtime and a lot of conversation around. But secondly, there is innate distance between the struggle of individuals. So regardless if opposition claims that these are struggles that you know because they're your father or your mother or your brother, these are still a secondary lens. So the reader or the viewer is always viewing it through third-party kinds of lenses. That means it's never the victim telling the reader what exactly they struggle in. It's a third person telling the victim about what another person is struggling in. So there is always an innate form of distance that exists within the reading of the book. That means there's always a lack of ability to empathize or a lack of ability to relate, because you're unable to actually bridge the gap to get to those experiences. And this is the missing nuance of OG. Because OG tells you that they're able to empathize better and have better catharsis, but the reason why opposition is unable to claim the similar benefit of catharsis is because they have that multiple barriers that individuals have to break through when they read the book and when they see these experiences, which is an exclusive analysis that comes from CG. Therefore, what are direct victims likely to tell you, or what portraying direct victims' experiences are likely to do? We think there are three things. Number one, the ability for you to enter the psychology of the victim, which is the innate uniqueness that opposition will never get. Because while they can enter psychologies of third-party bystanders or fathers and mothers, they are unable to ever enter the psychology of the individual that's actually facing this level of discrimination. And this is how we differentiate from OG here. Because OG explains why entering is something that necessarily means that you're able to be cathartic, but they don't explain the kinds of entering that happens and why the innate experiences is important for you to understand what happens in these individual minds. So the illustration is very simple. You understand two things when you're able to convey a direct victim's mentality. Number one, you understand emotion unlike a skill that you're not able to experience. So they can say you experience emotion like grief. We experience emotion like fear and anxiety. When the cop car pulls out as an African American and you have a gun in your, like, I don't know, that thing in the car, I don't drive. You have a gun there. Like, necessarily you are able to convey that level of fear and that level of anxiety of this individual, and convey to people why is it that African Americans are so scared of the police to that extent. You're able to explain this level of heightened sense of emotion and fear that grabs the reader's attention and grabs the news spotlight, because you're writing books that are unlikely ever written before. But secondly, you're able to encapsulate thought processes. So now you know why the minority runs. Now you know why the minority doesn't talk to the police. And now you know why the Asian person has a tendency towards self-harm, because it's a thought process of why I think this way, why I feel this way, that not only the majority doesn't get, but probably other members of your own community cannot understand as well. So it not just increases empathy of a majoritarian individuals towards minorities, but our own minority communities towards each other, because it's a kind of empathy and a kind of relation of individual perspective that is untoward seen in an ability for you to write this way. Secondly, you're also able to convey types of experiences, because they rely on common lived experiences. They're unable to show you what happens behind closed doors, struggles that minorities that are never talked about, the abuse that happens of your father, the abuse that happens when your father is like overworked at a construction site and you necessarily have to come home and you see him abuse your mother. Those are things that you will never see in lots of instances, because those are shameful things that individuals on their side don't talk about. Those are the only experiences you get there. When loved ones abuse and pressure of being an Asian, the kind of cyclical nature of your parents forcing you to get an A, something that they will never show because they cannot experience it. They only can show like the Asian kids studying really hard in school, because that's what everybody sees. But you don't see the dark side of the family. You don't see those things. And it's a unique experience that CG tells you about. Wait, it is important because discussions are never about specific struggles. So opening doesn't realize what kinds of struggles are actually being talked about. CG is the unique one that tells you that we can portray struggles untoward, never seen before. Struggles that are innately visceral and experiential within these individuals. But third, you're also able to portray perpetrators in different light. So they can only portray them as blank-faced characters in which you can never relate with. We are showing you that individuals, people and actions are scarily similar. That means people not just relate with the individuals that are doing these actions towards minorities, but the kinds of actions they're doing. This has two immediate impacts. Number one, this puts into perspective of individuals who read. Sometimes microaggression is something that's unknown because it's something that is what's the word? Because it's something that's subconscious. You don't actively act out a microaggression. But reading a book that tells you that your actions are microaggressions actively tell individuals of their struggles. And it's unique from what CG says. But secondly, it also empowers call-outs and inspires bravery of similar individuals who on the comparative just don't access that level of call-outs. Go on.
Yeah, when men believe that the patriarchy and misogyny is no longer real, when you tell them that they don't see this from the perspective of the observer, how do you expect them to empathize with the victim?
Okay, yeah, I'll get to this. Three things. Why are there three major impacts that she's able to clear? The point in which the actor cares about this. Number one, in terms of catharsis and representation, you're able to tell the story your way. But uniquely, you're able to tell the stories behind closed doors. Stories that OG never talks about, and stories that only CG tells you the individuals are uniquely able to access. But secondly, you're able to access levels of community support. Because as OO claims, these individuals necessarily means that they've lived experiences and therefore these are normalized. This is a ridiculous claim. I'm unclear as to why these things are normalized for individuals. But even if they are, these kinds of experiences are inherently isolating. So the individual that experiences discrimination thinks that I am the only one and it's my fault. When a book gets written about that, that validates the experiences that you are not alone in this experience. And that's a powerful message to tell to minority communities why they are not alone in their struggles and other individuals can relate, and other prominent individuals that can relate. So therefore they should seek the same levels of help and take the same level of access. And that's where success also comes from. So commercial viability was important. It was important to tell minorities that were not alone so that they buy a goddamn book, so that they're able to read it and see those levels of experiences and do it. But third, on commercial viability, they claim they're unable to understand the backlash. It's horrible because what makes a book sell? Like, I can't empathize with hobbits climbing a mountain because I'm not a hobbit and I don't climb a mountain. But I can empathize with the kinds of experiences that these people feel, and that's uniquely what sells. So no, you're not able to empathize with the black individual, but you're able to empathize with injustice in the world, with unfairness in the world, that people in every strata of society feel. And that is what draws empathy towards these individuals. So if it was about commercialized success, CG proves to you why necessary that empathy was a prerequisite to get that commercial success. And only by experiencing individuals via this method was commercial success viable. This fulfills all three burdens of the actor. This is why CG clearly takes this debate.
Would like to thank the Member of Government for that fine speech. Now to the Member of the Opposition to begin the CO case. Hear, hear.
NUS! NUS! NUS!
Thank you, guys. Sorry, just a moment to rearrange the papers. Not ready?
Whenever you're ready.
Three extensions in his speech. Firstly, why we are psychologically better for this individual. Secondly, why we are more likely to get political change. Lastly, why the market for perspectives of victims is already saturated, which will fulfill both of the prior burdens. Firstly, then, on why we are psychologically better for this individual. I want to observe that opening opposition asserts that writing from a different perspective is inherently cathartic. They don't explain why or how writing from the perspective of victims could be the opposite of cathartic, psychologically damaging, what I will talk about now. Two reasons why. Number one, oftentimes repeating trauma and revisiting trauma worsens harm and worsens your psychological state, doesn't benefit it. Oftentimes, the experiences as a minority that you're going to be exploring through this work are the most painful experiences of your life. Being beaten, being sexually assaulted, watching your mother be beaten by your father. Clearly, all of these things are really bad things to experience. And reliving it by describing it in detail on a paper is not cathartic for many individuals. Oftentimes, it is a form of spiraling and a form of rumination, right? Oftentimes, revisiting trauma causes you to think more about that trauma. And the more you think about the trauma, the more psychological power it has. Think about how, for example, if your friend kept talking about their ex over and over and over again, months after they broke up, that's not a person who's psychologically healthy. That's the person who's ruminating and fixating and spiraling to become psychologically worse. Clearly, then, in all of these cases, it is a bad thing that you are revisiting this trauma in your work, not a good thing. Secondly, in the comparative, imagining an outside observer creates hope that things can change, that people care about you, people, want things to be better for you. Oftentimes, for victims, the main source of hope is the idea that tomorrow can be better, not that yesterday was bad. Clearly, we gave you the latter, not the former. Secondly, marketing your trauma exposes you to a lot of guilt. No, let's assume that this person is either successful or not successful. If you're not successful, think about it. You just poured out your heart only to be ignored. You go to book fairs and no one shows up, no one queues up. You hold your book up hoping people read it and no one does. This is not cathartic. It is psychologically damaging because you feel neglected by society as a whole. But if you are successful, you are directly profiting from the experiences of the most vulnerable in your community. OG is correct. The people who are the most vulnerable are often blue-collar workers. The people who are writers are people with education and social security nets. This means that you don't have the right epistemic access to these experiences yourself most of the time if you're in a privileged enough position to be a career writer, something that's famously a risky thing to do. This means that when you profit from this, you feel guilty, you feel worse. No, this flips all their material as well about how you can directly experience these things. More often than not, the people who are Palestinian and are privileged enough to be able to get onto movies are not the ones whose houses are directly being bulldozed. It is those who happen to be Western educated and therefore able to pick up a pen and write and get the attention of Western journalists. But even if you are successful, you often get political pushback from political opposition, people who cast doubt on your stories, who criticize you for not accurately representing people. And the critics will outnumber the people praising you, because if you think your work is good, you say great and you go home. But if you think it's bad, you leave bad reviews. You go and yell at them, and those are the voices that rise to the top. At this point in my speech, I reflect the main gov impact. No, clearly CO is ahead. Secondly, why we are better at getting change. I think that OO does a good job of explaining that you get more empathy, but they don't explain how empathy translates to change or how this gets better. I will do this now. Here is how. Number one, oftentimes, exploring observers can allow you to explore the transformation from a bystander to a person who is actively making things better. What does this mean? You are able to show how main characters establish their empathy, change their minds. To be clear, the bystander effect of thinking that yes, there is a problem, but there's nothing we can do about it is the biggest barrier to change, not knowing that there's a problem exists. For example, on outside of the house, we have stories like The Boy in Striped Pajamas, where you're able to show how individuals were brutally murdered, and the main character establishes that connection and gets out to feel like they can do something about it. But we can also show what they do. The main character doesn't just observe and go home, right? The fella does things to make life better. They donate, they go to activism, they show up to protest. For example, Yuval in No Man's Land was a Jewish person in that documentary who then goes out and protests against the Netanyahu government, illustrating what Jewish people in Israel can do to end the occupation. These are the tangible actions you can demonstrate people doing. What happens on their side? They can tell you that a problem exists. They can't tell you that people feel they're empowered to solve it. And to be clear, the flip here is that the more people think a problem exists and is really bad, oftentimes they feel psychologically debilitated because that problem is just so bad. What could we possibly do about it? What that means then is oftentimes this just flips all their material, because the more they show perspectives, the more they humanize, the worse people think problems are, the more impossible it is to solve them. I'll take opening.
So backlash is far worse on your side when you blame the majoritarian group for the oppression because there's something that they can do that they are not doing but that the white character is doing.
So, actually, I'm reclaiming my time. So, that's true of showing you can do anything. So on your side, if you show a direct victim who gets oppressed and then you can do nothing about it, that's a terrible way to try and get any amount of social change. With this material, you should believe that the feeling that you're able to get change is inherently cathartic. When you're writing, you can imagine that people will read it and change their minds, that people will donate, that people will show up to a good cause. This is independent of whether or not you are able to get book sales. You can imagine that thing actuating. But the fact that you are writing about your experience probably means that political change is the most important thing you care about. Otherwise, you'll be writing bestsellers like detective novels or fantasy. Like, I don't see that many non-fiction stories or fiction stories about the lives of minorities only about those experiences or observers, right? This therefore means that political change is probably your first priority. CO is the only thing that actually bridges that gap in this debate. Last extension, why the market for the perspective of victims is already saturated. I just want to observe that there are counterfactual ways by which victims already shared experiences, mainly social media and the media at large. This is because, and why is it likely that these things are already saturated? Number one, the barriers of entry for these things are extremely low and are getting lower still. Most people in Palestine already have cell phones and are already documenting their day-to-day experiences of finding their homes devastated and the bombs that are raining down upon them. Most individuals who experience police brutality can literally film the police officer doing it, right? And the media has an incentive to go after these people because oppression and injustice make good news. They're sensationalists. They generate outrage and generate a sense of injustice happening. This therefore means that obviously these are already saturated perspectives. What does this mean? This means that you should prioritize the CO problem over the government problem. It's not that people don't know that there's a genocide in Palestine. It's not that people don't know that black people are oppressed. It's that people are bystanders. They believe that they are a cog in the machine. There's nothing they can do. When we show what observers can do, what change observers can make, by establishing those connections, by establishing that empathy, by breaking that bystander effect, we are the biggest impact in this debate. With this third extension, this material means that all of their material is significantly less important. Because if you believe that these things are saturated, then it doesn't matter that you're another voice in the sea of voices. It also means you're not able to be commercially successful. Because if people are already seeing the social media, people are already seeing the news, one more perspective, not something they'll invest money in getting, but a perspective of an observer who makes things better, hopes and fights for a better tomorrow. That's what we need in the 21st century now.
that fine speech about the political off the government side of this debate. Hear, hear.
Let's go, Raymond.
I first want to talk about the kinds of struggles that you go through as a community. Because it's not things like police brutality, genocide, or depiction of mass struggles that people are already aware about because they're depicted by the media. Rather, the book isn't about the perspective of the victim during the act of discrimination, but also the many more important contexts that aren't given the same kind of airtime that the media provides them. That is important characterization that allows us to be able to talk about their families, their backgrounds, their friends, their schooling times. Those are the important contexts that grounds and humanizes these individuals and these victims far better. The first thing I want to talk about is on the kinds of issues that are depicted by this book. The first issue is on OO. They say that a lot of these victims are often have normalized and internalized a lot of this very bad narrative. The issue here that we have to ask ourselves is, why are these issues normalized? They are oftentimes internalized by individuals because they are isolated experiences that individuals' beliefs are only unique to themselves. It is only when they hear through the perspective of a book, when they're able to validate their feelings of not only of being a victim, but also being one that is part of a larger superstructure, for example, that they're convinced themselves that they are not alone, that they're more convinced to get help. But secondly, because they're often uncomfortable talking to other people about it, and therefore the only method to break this off is via tapping into the psychology of potential victims. So even if victims themselves don't read the book, it's the fact that there are people that are not part of the victim, but part of the majoritarian race, people that are part of the perpetrator, they read the book and understand the kinds of microaggression that minorities go through, the kinds of small acts of discrimination that oftentimes goes unpassed because minorities are afraid to talk about them. So the kinds of community struggles that we portray are far more unique and personal. They're often unreported by the media. This wins over OG because we're able to explain that these are the issues that are often underreported and often goes unseen by the mainstream public, people that are unaware about these issues. It is on our side where you're able to depict the more unique struggles of these individuals, that individuals don't talk about them, don't talk about these things themselves because they're oftentimes too afraid and too ashamed to talk about these things. Most of Orwell's argument sounds as though the victim is themselves a Stockholm victim of discrimination. You're going to write the book in a way that fetishizes the victim. You're going to write the book in a way that whitewashes and talks about these issues in ways that are bad. The thing here is that you likely do have incentives to write the book in a way that calls out bad and problematic behaviors rather than whitewashing or downplaying and delegitimizing these issues. In fact, it's more compelling to write in the victim's POV where those small signs that often go undetected that climax into something that's a lot more dangerous for the victim. That's where you have a more compelling book because those are the things that victims are able to experience as far more visceral and far more graphic. Secondly, even though the victim is in the book is not real, the struggles that they face certainly are in this instance. So we're able to prove as what the vast majority of victims do feel a sense of catharsis from this particular book. But the last claim of OO here is that the book is going to be damn depressing, but it doesn't always have to be. You can still show the victim being rehabilitated after their trauma. You're able to show them being surrounded by their friends, for instance, so you can do something about it. It doesn't have to be as depressing and as bad as what OO and CO talks about this book to be, because they assume that the book will be written in a certain way. We argue that the book is likely going to be written well on both sides. It's about the things that you're writing that changes. Secondly, the argument is about buy-in. I would argue that guilt is a good feeling here, because the people that do read these kinds of books tend to be more open-minded and somewhat progressive, even they're part of the majoritarian community per OG's framing. So it's not just very sure as to why this is something that is bad. I would argue this is also just not unique. Like it's unclear why you don't feel the same kind of guilt. It's summarized from the perspective of a grieving mother or Korean feminist, for example. So it's very unclear whether or not this is something that actually decreases buy-in on their side. Secondly, I would argue that victim mentality is good for the very problem they all identify, which is that people are unaware that they are often victims, but this only works for these kinds of struggles, because these kinds of struggles are the kinds of struggles that victims themselves don't talk about to anyone else. And therefore, if they are not validated by anyone, at least they're validated by the book, at least they are convinced that they are not alone in this particular struggle. They that they're able to find a way out. On our side, that book is probably the only source of solace for these individuals to validate the kind of struggles that they go through. Lastly, I'll talk about CO. CO's argument here is about psychology, but the issue here is that this is not about just only trauma. Like, Ian talks about this is only going to be the depiction of trauma, but likely this also shows the solvency of the trauma as well. But it's just very unclear as to who is the person reading the book on off bench. Because all says it's people that are unaware that they are victims, but CO says it's victims that are damn traumatized about their experiences. So if I would argue that most people are just unaware about their trauma, so often this exposes the kind of situations that they are in, and therefore shows the urgency and the need to opt out of these situations. But secondly, I would argue that if it is so traumatizing, you're not forced to read through the entirety of the book. If you find it to be triggering, you are able to opt out of the book anyways. You are still able to find other books you're able to read also. So it's just very unclear as to why this is a unique impact coming from CO. But lastly, I would argue that for the vast majority of individuals that do go through trauma, exposure therapy is something that is good because it gradually desensitizes these traumas, and therefore it is perceived as not being as scary or as bad as what people view themselves to be. So actually before that.
So why do you have to go through exposure therapy publicly, right? Like, if talking about it with a friend, family, or therapist is good,
yeah,
why would you need to write a book?
The issue is that you don't talk to anyone about it because of the struggles that you go through. Only on our side, if you have no one to talk to, at least the book feels like your only source of solace in this instance. This thing thinks that you get backlash and political change, but that's contingent on the book being very poorly written. You can write a book about an observer that simply cannot change things, that feels powerless, that feels helpless. So on their side, that idea of it being a very depressing book can also still occur. So it's very unclear as to whether or not CO actually has any kinds of meaningful benefits in this debate. But lastly, I would argue that on our side, you don't get the same degree of backlash, and in fact you get more empathy. You just explore the psychological aspects of the victim, and therefore the people that do read these books, people that are often aware about discrimination, but not aware about the extent of that discrimination, are now more aware about these things, and therefore more cautious and more observant in the ways in which they interact with their friends who are from a minority background. So on our side, not only are you able to encourage the victim to speak out, but you also ensure that the perpetrators get a sense of perspective, especially if these are small acts of discrimination. Lastly, I also want to say that on their side, it's just unclear as to why the media talks about these things. Because I would argue that the media talks about things in ways that are highly, not only generalized, but highly sensationalized, and therefore don't portray the real lived experiences of victims. It's only on our side where you're able to make sure that you capitalize on your own experience as a minority writer and write from that particular perspective. Because if you're a minority writer, you do have the same incentive to want to forward the cause. You have the same incentive to want to make sure that people from your community are given the same kind of help and the same kind of awareness. But that doesn't occur under their side. Because the things they're talking about from the observer's perspective are just not things that people are able to empathize with, because they're already bombarded by the news, they're bombarded by so many other different media that talks about these things in ways that are already sensationalized and in ways that are generalized already to the entire community. But only on our side, not only are you able to build the character from the ground up and gives very grounded and very humane context surrounding these characters, but more importantly, you're able to show the kinds of struggles that they go through that otherwise wouldn't have been depicted.
Fine speech, now that the option moves close up debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
NUS, NUS, NUS.
Takes for bad things to happen in the world is for good people to stand by and do nothing. We do understand struggle, but oftentimes what we don't understand is our role in it, or the absence of our role in it. Catharsis therefore comes from calling out, from painting a critical picture of the majority, an introspective picture, a picture that allows them to sit there and reflect and go, why do I do this? Or why do I do nothing? Oftentimes, we don't want to think that we're bad people. Ian explains that there is a high bar to want to believe these things. Or oftentimes, we think our role is negligible, or we direct it to others. Or oftentimes, we feel debilitated. The crucial difference on both sides of the house is that on Gov bench, when you portray direct suffering, you have to portray the other as the villain. There is no path to salvation. You are a bad person or you're not. On our side of the house, we have the optionality to say that you can do something, you can make a difference, you can be more than a bystander. If you are, perhaps that's something you should think about. There are 3 clashes in this debate which I'm going to weigh against GovBench, and then I'm going to weigh against our opening. The first claim that GovBench makes is they say we need visceral depictions as opposed to statistics, and this is what closing also adds on the nuance. They say we uniquely need to know how you feel in that moment as opposed to just statistics or figures, so on and so forth. But I think there are a host of other alternatives that meet this precise criteria in the status quo. Ian tells you that the news is sensationalist. Oftentimes minorities share their direct experiences on social media. You see what's going on in people in Gaza and Ukraine. You see the day-to-day lives of individuals, how they have to make bread from pasta, how they go days without being able to eat anything at all. Oftentimes there are biographies, there's activism, there's protest. Many books have been written before. When we think about the struggle of immigrants, we think about Alan Kurdi, the little boy who washed up on a beach because his parents wanted a better life. When we think about women who suffer under oppression, we think of Malala and her experiences about how she got shot. And when we think about the oppression of black people in the United States, we think about the last moments of George Floyd as his neck was pressed down and he couldn't breathe. We have seen the faces of these people. We have seen the struggles of these communities. But even if you don't buy that response, Ian tells you that there are other ways you can necessarily integrate your community into these books because they are observing something, right? And that something is likely the struggles of your communities and how it therefore necessarily exists. So the debate wasn't between talking about your struggle or not talking about your struggle. It was the perspective of the individual that therefore dealt with your struggle. Ian also explains to you here that it's not cathartic per se to necessarily talk about the struggle that you continually go through because that's just a repeating of your trauma and it's unlikely to make you feel better. You can oftentimes talk about it to other people in your community. Writing about it therefore doesn't have to be the way you get it. Like if you want your community to read about it, presumably you would also talk to them about it. Oftentimes these variety of other ways of things are people that are accessible to your community. You as a writer likely want to do something different. First clash out. The second clash in this debate is about who this writer is and how they therefore necessarily do these experiences. And this is important because this determines how well they're able to write on either side of the house. The claim that opening government makes is that you don't want to pretend, so on and so forth. The closing backs this up when they go, you basically don't want to whitewash yourself. Ian explains to you the nuance of who this direct individual is. Ian says there's someone who is relatively more privileged within their community. There's someone who has the option to be a writer. Oftentimes if you're from a minority community, your parents put an emphasis on you to get a real job as opposed to doing things like this. And to be a writer, you oftentimes have to be incredibly literate. You have a great deal of access to education, which means this person is one who oftentimes will have closer connections to the observers or majorities as opposed to other people within the community. This is the unique reason why they're likely to be able to write well about it. They're somewhere in between. They understand the struggles of their community and they also see the apathy of other people. They see the excuses that individuals give and they see the absence of it. This is better than what our opening says because DLO says, but you can just research to other people, you can talk about it and therefore you're able to understand. But first, I don't know how you're going to gain access to those connections if you are someone locked into a minority community. Ian's frame on this person explains that, but also I think in this room we all agree that writing from your lived experiences is better and that's something we're therefore necessarily able to do on our side of the house. But I note here that closing government has a much better claim. They say, regardless of whether you're not someone who's adjacent to a majority community, you still can't enter the psyche of them no matter how much you want to try. I agree. The fact that you can't enter their psyche no matter how proximate you are is perfectly fine. It means you don't understand why they don't understand. And that's something that comes across in your writing. The absence of a reason, not knowing how they see the struggle and feel nothing about it, how they stand by and do nothing, are all things that are incredibly potent and poignant to write about. And the crucial tipping point here is their side has to condemn the majorities for doing nothing. Our side allows them to come to that conclusion themselves when they too realize they don't have a reason as to why they don't do nothing. They too don't have a reason as to why they don't care. Therefore, the second claim on how this individual writes well, we explain to you the nuance that we get from this person much better than our opening, but we also explain that even if we don't have it perfectly, that is enough because the absence itself is valuable. Before I move on to the third claim, I will take closing.
Who reads the book?
not a lot of people these days, unfortunately, but I think majorities tend to do this significantly more. And that's why they're likely to pick it up and therefore necessarily read it. As you explained, the minorities, very oppressed, very struggle, not much education. I don't think they'll appreciate it to the same degree, but in any case, they're likely to shrug and support you regardless because you talk about your experiences. The third claim in this debate is who can you necessarily convince? And top half tries to wash this out because they say this is fundamentally speculative. Our opening says, but you know, white people are never going to listen because they're racist and hateful first. There's a spectrum of individuals that we're therefore necessarily talking about. Most people aren't bad. Most people just don't reflect. And that's the unique nuance we're going to be able to necessarily get you here. Ian explains that there is a saturation of media about the struggles of individuals. We see photos of starving African children all the time, but how many of us in this room actually ever bother to donate, right? We know that struggle exists, but we don't know why we don't bother to deal with it. And that's the unique difference we have on our side of the house. The way up in this debate therefore turns on guilt. Yes, there might be guilt on both sides. On Gov bench, there is guilt because you are someone who necessarily results in others being victims. And on our side, there might be guilt because you're an apathetic bystander. Here's how we break that deadlock on guilt in two ways. The first is that Ian explains, to make someone a victim means you always have to villainize. We offer them a path to salvation. You can be better. You can be different. You just need to think. The second one is what I explained earlier. Even if they don't know why they don't care, they come to the conclusion themselves as opposed to condemning them. Now CG what then says it doesn't have to just be about observers. It can be about empowering minorities. But minorities have to empower themselves because to give up necessarily means to die. It's questionable how they're going to do it. Are they going to suck it up? We put the burden on the people who need to think about this a bit more.